Morning, guys. How are we doing today? Today we're going to do something a little more concise than I normally do. We're not going to do a deep dive here. We're just going to do a quick brush through what are the dozen most important jazz labels of the 50s into the mid-60s. And that's the era I'm most familiar with, and I've collected the lion's share of the bodies of work of these labels. The 78 era comes with its whole own body of labels that are very different from what happens in the LP era. And once you get into the mid 60s, a lot of these 50s labels are gone or are in decline. And by the mid 60s into the 70s, a whole new genre and era of labels spring up. But we're going to focus on, like I said, the bebop, hard bop era into the beginnings of free and the avant-garde. What are the great labels of that time frame? And in making this list, I had to exclude some labels I love. To make it only a dozen wasn't an easy task, because I'm a big fan of 24 labels. Some of the labels that we're going to exclude here include the great fantasy label of the Weiss brothers and Brubeck from the Bay Area, who also had the debut series, and fantasy, of course, launches OJC. So fantasy is a very important label, but they're known for Creedence Clearwater's after anything else. Jubilee, a great label out of New York that has some really great titles in '58, but their body of work doesn't extend much before or after that. The Roost Roulette conglomerate. The Roost years are magnificent, but run 53 to 59. It's kind of a short window, only about 40, 50 LPs. And then Roulette's a bit more of a hodgepodge. And there's some stuff from the canon on Roulette, but there's also, it seems to be more of anonymous, stuff that doesn't seem to have as much value as some other titles do. ABC, of course, was the precursor to Impulse. I'm not going to include them with Impulse. I'm going to keep them as a separate entity off the list. United Artists, which we just talked about in 1959, has some great records from 59 through about 63-4. But again, they don't make the cut. The Dawn label from 55, 56, 57 has 30 titles. A lot of them are amazing. They're not going to make the cut. Candid, VJ, CTI, Capitol, all those labels aren't going to make it. Capitol, to me, is the one that dabbles the most in jazz without doing anything serious. And it's not to say there's not some great jazz on Capitol, but it's predominantly by white people. It's predominantly meant to sell with a sugary coating. You know, it's not full of very many vitamins anymore because it's kind of been mass produced. And that's Capitol in a nutshell. And then the black artists they do have tend to be Nat Cold. You know, we love you, Nat King Cole, but we need a bow tie, and we're going to put some makeup on you to lighten you up a little bit. And again, we're talking the 50s and the 60s. Race was more predominant in people's mindsets then than it is now. But they really don't ever let us forget race, do they? You can't turn on the TV without being reminded of race. And the whites being kept in fear and the blacks being kept in fear. And scared people are easy to manipulate. You know, that's what history will tell us. And they've got us both on our edge. The blacks live in constant fear of the tyranny, of extinction, of losing their children. It's an exhausting experience. The tension that they live in, even LeBron James said yesterday, it's scary being a black male. And the whites live in fear constantly of what they think is going to be black reprisals, of what they think is going to be this black militancy that, for what I've never seen, never really exists. The black community isn't that way. It's one that wants to say, you know, we've had enough violence. Let's turn that pipe off and let's try to find some peace. It takes agitation by a very small amount of people to keep the tension as furious as it is. But this whole American plot plays out in the music industry throughout the decades. And it's not subliminally there, it's very consciously there. And whenever black and white starting to find some unity, disco era. The black charts and the white charts started to look the same. They were buying the same records. Casey and the Sunshine Band, everybody liked that. And the problem was everybody started breeding to it. And racially interbreeding. And there's a whole chunk of this country that gets real uncomfortable. And they see that as their way of living being attacked. Love is love. Two people love each other. You know, who are you to interfere? And it's just such a sad narrative, but it's about control. You know, and the whites are being as played and manipulated by this thing as the blacks are. I just put this big mural up in my bathroom of, I believe it's Akrotiri, but it's in the Aegean for sure. It's a Greek island. It's got the blue dome with the white stucco buildings, and all the people's little outside areas have chairs sitting out staring at the sea, staring at the yonder cliffs. There's no sight of television screens. And here in America, we have our face in a screen all day long. It's never been easier to sell the narrative. It's never been easier to convince Americans of the fear that they constantly need to live in, and that do not cut the funding for the programs that will protect you and defend you. It's sinister, but yet it's as old as time. It's just how it is. And that's why we understand history, so we can understand the machine that's happening in the present. And that seems to escape a lot of people, like, oh, what happened in the past can't be happening. No, it's absolutely happening now. Greed operates with the same principles in all stages. Not to get too sidetracked, but once in a while I need to throw some of that in there. It's shameful how we've let race shape our identities and our personalities and our ways of living. It makes no sense. But anyway, so those labels we're not going to talk about. And we're just going to brush through this. This isn't going to be a big in-depth look at each label. I've done a lot of that stuff. This is going to be a fun ranking of the top 12 labels. First, I want to give an honorable mention at number 13 to a label that I love dearly. And to me, it was the hardest one to not put on my top 12. And that's Bethlehem. I'm a big fan of Bethlehem. I love the 10-inch series. I love the BCP 6000. I love it's great. I have almost 200 Bethlehem LPs. It's predominantly driven by East Coast black and white and West Coast white kids. And a lot of great singers as well, both black and white. And it was hard for me not to include Bethlehem, but for me, of the 12 I did choose, Bethlehem's windows of operation where they were making an impact is very small. It's really 54, 55, 56, 57, and then the King sale happens, and everything that comes out on Bethlehem after that's more likely to be King sessions from the late 50s that they're reissuing with the Bethlehem logo. But Bethlehem Records and the vibe of what Bethlehem was from 53 to 57, it's a special era, but it doesn't have enough of an impact time-wise to make my list. So Bethlehem, we love you, but you sit at number 13. Unlucky, I guess. And that's probably why you are unlucky at 13. You didn't make the dozen. That's it. Nothing more. No black cat to it. You just didn't make the dozen. See what I'm saying? Ain't no fun being the 13th disciple. Ain't no fun being the 13th day. 12 gets you in. See what I'm saying? So let's dive in real quick. Number 12, ARGO. ARGO is a subsidiary of Chess Records in Chicago, run by Phil and Leonard Chess. Great blues label, early R&B. They decided to start a jazz imprint called ARGO in 1955-56. Originally, the first album by Al Hibbler comes out as a Marteri label, but they quickly switch it back to ARGO. And then they get into a lawsuit with a UK label called ARGO and have to switch it to Cadet 150 titles later, which I thought was unfortunate. I like the ARGO name quite a lot. But ARGO, it's number 12 on the list. It's got a lot of rather anonymous titles to the average person. I'd say about a third of it's firmly in the jazz canon. Everything that's not in the canon or not well known is still great. Chicago-based R&B, jazz, blues. It's a really solid label. It's got some important recordings by guys like Johnny Griffin, the great Sonny Stitt, Ahmad Jamal, Ramsey Lewis. There's a lot of really solid artists that make important records. Max Roach makes a great record with Hank Mobley early in the 600 series. So like I said, there's a good, in the first 150 titles, probably 40 of them are in the canon and are important pieces of jazz collectability. None of them will fetch big bucks, but some of them will get near 100, especially the few that haven't been reissued, like the Paul Gonsalves, the Clark Terry. Those records can go for pretty good money. So that's number 12. Number 11 on my list is Pacific Records. I love Pacific Records, formed by Roy Hart on the West Coast, with his partner whose name I can't think of right now. Tip of my tongue. I'll try to type it in later. Pacific is a wonderful label. It starts in the early 50s with a lot of great 10 inches. Jerry Mulligan, Lee Konitz, Chet Baker, Bud Freeman, Russ Freeman. A lot of really great West Coast hard cool. It's not the smooth cool, it's the hard cool. It's a driving, really well-fueled, predominantly white label with fairly good distribution in the 50s for a jazz label. Their records are definitely were out there. By the PJ series that starts in the 1959-60, they restarted number 1. The series then moves to a bit more of a soul jazz, West Coast soul, kind of organ-based, Les McCann, Groove Holmes, those kind of cats. But there's still great stuff like Carmel Jones, Curtis Amy, Bud Shanks, real important guys at Pacific Records. They sold a lot of records. Chet Baker's legacy alone at Pacific makes them firmly entrenched in this top dozen. To the beginner collector, Baker's going to be the first name you really come across that you're just like, oh, I need to look for some Chet Baker on Pacific. And then probably Mulligan, Konitz, a few other cats. Once you dive deeper into jazz, you'll realize how important Pacific Records is. But Chico Hamilton, another huge factor at Pacific Records. So it's a giant of a label with 200-300 important jazz records. And I would say at least half of that's important stuff in the jazz canon. So that's a pretty good number. Number 10 on my list is Emarcy. And if you were just taking the early to late 50s, Emarcy would be number 1 or 2. But Emarcy gets phased out by Mercury by 59-60, and the Mercury label itself kind of just takes over. Smash is an R&B label that a few jazz titles come out on as well. Wing is another Mercury subsidiary. But Emarcy comes around in the early 50s. There's a great 10-inch series followed by a great 36,000 LP series. From Sarah Vaughan to Helen Merrill to Clifford Brown, Max Roach. There's some real important records being made in Emarcy. 54, 55, 56, even into 57. A great deal of Cannonball Adderley's work early is at the Emarcy label. His brother Nat makes a couple great records on Emarcy. Max Roach, after Clifford Brown passes, continues to make great records at Emarcy. And again, I would have them higher, except they're phased out by Mercury by 1960. And there's still some good titles coming out on Mercury in 60 and forward. But it starts to become a little more commercial, a little less dedicated to the true artistry of the innovative black cutting edge. And they were very not afraid to be cutting edge black in 53, 54, 55, 56. Dinah Washington, Sarah Vaughan. They were recording some legendary sessions with some really important figures. Errol Garner has a lot of great early stuff on Emarcy. So Emarcy has a very firm place, and there's really about 150, 170 records in the 36,000 series in Emarcy before it phases into Mercury. And there's also a large 10-inch discography from the early 50s, and I would say about half of that's also in the jazz canon pretty firmly. So you got to give a lot of love to Emarcy. And again, if you looked at just the mid-50s, it would be number 1 or 2. It's such a great label at that moment. Number 9 is Contemporary. Great West Coast label. Lester Koenig is the founder. They did a lot of cutting-edge stuff on the West Coast with guys like Shelly Manne, Andre Previn, Barney Kessel, the great Pole Winner series. Hampton Hawes makes a string of great records at Contemporary. They're kind of renowned to the beginner collector for housing a couple of Sonny Rollins records, including Way Out West, which most young collectors will find that pretty soon in their books and in their research. And then they also do the first 2 records by a young Ornette Coleman. And those Coleman records were a precursor to what he was going to do at Atlantic in '59 and going forward with free jazz. But Contemporary takes some chances on some pretty out there stuff. Cecil Taylor has a record there fairly early on. But the body of the work is Shelly Manne and that kind of crew. It's the Howard Rumsey All-Stars make about 8 or 9 records. Lenny Niehaus has a number of really great records. A lot of these guys at Contemporary, some of them at Pacific, a lot of the guys that played at Bethlehem on the West Coast were actually studio musicians at Capitol Records. And they were making kind of schlocky, watered-down jazz at Capitol. And then they would come to Contemporary, and they weren't leaders on those Capitol records. They were sidemen, part of studio groups, recording vocals and recording softer jazz for lighter consumption. And they would go to Contemporary Pacific Bethlehem and cut down some real heavy chops and let go and really play. And you really realize how talented a lot of those West Coast kids were. The Charlie Marianos, the Williamson brothers, Max Bennett, Stan Levy. It's a pretty sick bunch of kids that all could play. Frank Rosalino. It's pretty endless. And so Contemporary is number 9 on my list. Number 8 is Atlantic. In the 1200 series at Atlantic, launches in '55. It struggles a little bit to find its way with some Mabel Mercer and some Wilbur de Paris kind of Dixieland stuff, but it's also sprinkling in some pretty cutting edge stuff with guys like Jimmy Joffrey and Warren Marsh, and doing great stuff with Teddy Charles. And then Charles Mingus makes Pithecanthropus erectus and a string of 5-6 records at Atlantic that are pretty landmark. And then by 1958-59, Giant Steps, the great Ornette Coleman record, Change of the Century, Our Music, those records start showing up, illustrating just how risky Atlantic was going to be. By the 60s, Atlantic slips more into the soul jazz, as most labels do, with guys like Hank Crawford. Les McCann comes over from Pacific. Atlantic in the 60s definitely still makes some great titles. Ray Charles, of course, is one of the real important pieces at Atlantic. He's mostly a R&B guy on the 8000 series, but he's doing some jazz stuff in the 1200 series. That's, of course, fantastic. Milt Jackson's records on Atlantic are very notable and outstanding. A guy I'm a huge fan of, without question. Big Milt Jackson guy. And then, of course, the Modern Jazz Quartet, which was kind of chamber jazz and not everyone's a big fan of. There's some beautiful records that they make. John Lewis is a very thoughtful player. He's trying to bring the Western European tradition to meet in with the African American tradition of jazz. And some of his compositions work better than others. Some are more funky than others, more grooving than others. But you can tell when Milt Jackson gets on his own, he can't wait to tear loose and play the blues. But it's still an important part of the jazz canon. And a lot of white homes would have MJQ records, and that would be the few jazz records they bought. You know, going back to the early 50s, MJQ had crossover success, and that's important. Number 7 on my list is the great Savoy label, Herman Lubinsky. Herman Lubinsky was a giant of a man and a very awful person at the same time. Treated his black musicians really horribly. Savoy's golden era is really post-war, late 40s into the early 50s, where they're recording Dizzy Gillespie, Fats Navarro, Charlie Parker, Coleman Hawkins. It's a pretty impressive list of cats, Lester Young, that they're tracking in the late 40s after the recording band. A lot of it's very cutting edge for the time, and as the 50s come along, Lubinsky's allowing these black kids to make some pretty cutting edge stuff. Donald Byrd's early recordings, Hank Mobley's first 2 albums as a leader, even though they were kind of split, a group session, to be honest. Lee Morgan shows up, makes his first record with Mobley. Cannonball Adderley's first recordings are here. The great Kenny Clark, the great drummer, has a lot of great sessions that he's leading with guys like Ernie Wilkins, and there's also a ton of anonymous white jazz artists that all can play, but almost all of them have become really obscure. Guys like Eddie Burt, who are great trombonists, who would win Musicians of the Year, like just great talents, but have become completely forgotten in today's jazz landscape. And by the dawning of the 60s, Savoy's in decline. Their releases are sporadic. They signed Curtis Fuller in 659-60, and they put out like 3 records of his kind of back to back, which is as much telling you how little else they got to put out and how little they're recording cutting edge modern jazz. And they start moving towards gospel and R&B, and they're still putting out some interesting titles in the 60s. Some Bill Hardman stuff. There's some stuff coming out from Kenny Barron. Wilbur Harden has some records coming out in 60, 61. But by the mid-60s, the jazz is no longer really a thing at Savoy, and they move on. But their body of work is so strong from the late 40s into the early mid-50s that they definitely belong here at number 7. Number 6 is Columbia Epic. And Epic is a subsidiary of Columbia, and when you lump them together, their body of work is really impressive. And Epic actually probably has more cutting-edge recordings jazz-wise by black musicians than Columbia does early on, but Columbia gets with it. When they sign the Blakeys and the Donald Byrds and the Miles Davises and the Thelonious Monks and the Charles Mingus's, Columbia single-handedly is pushing the new sound of modern jazz to the masses like no other label can or does. Yeah, the great major labels don't touch the real jazz that Columbia delves into, and there's a compromise. You know, Miles had to make some stuff that was more accessible. Brubeck's making records that are somewhat more commercial than his stuff at Fantasy, but those records still sold really well compared to what a jazz label could push, and it really helps promote the body of jazz, and it's actually really shaped the modern day collector's viewpoint, because Columbia still has a marketing department. Columbia still is reissuing box sets and CDs and downloading packages for these great artists that they sign. And because they still have a marketing department, it's those artists that seem to stay prevalent in the eyes of today's collector. And the average collector today knows Columbia and Blue Note. You know, Blue Note's really found a resurgence with today's collector, and they have an incredible value kind of beyond their initial impact, you know. But Columbia is definitely an important label that had a great impact on the music. I'm playing a record, oddly enough, that's not in my canon in terms of these great labels, by the great Charlie Shavers. I just got this. It's on the Everest label, and it's fantastic, honestly. There's been a couple tracks that blew me away. One of them's going to go on my next Throat Grabbers, actually. So that moves us to number 5 on the list, and that would be Impulse. Impulse was started by the ABC Film Company. They brought Creed Taylor over from Bethlehem. He was producing records at the ABC studios, and he convinced them to launch a deluxe jazz package series called Impulse, with the gatefold, the black and orange spine. They were going to cost $1 more than the average LP, but they were going to be coffee table desirable art pieces with great covers, laminated photographs, wonderful instructionals on the inside, great liner notes. Impulse was a beautiful package, well designed, well presented by Creed Taylor and Company. Impulse lives on the back of John Coltrane. He was their big coup that they signed, and him being able to sign Coltrane probably convinces ABC to allow him this liberty. Of course, the contract that they signed with Coltrane allowed him a lot of artistic freedom, and that was a bit of a death knell for Creed Taylor's time at Impulse, because Coltrane was going to push the boundaries and limits every chance he could, and he still makes some really great commercial stuff with ballads and Johnny Hartman and the Duke Ellington record, but he's also trying to make the Village Vanguard and Africa Brass, and it's fairly out there for 1960-61, and they have a lot of more commercial titles in the early years. Guys like Ray Charles, Lionel Hampton, Max Roach makes some great records, McCoy Tyner makes some great records. There's some really fantastic stuff, and some pretty weird titles as well. A couple of college jazz records are recorded, and a lot of college kids could play jazz in those years. They had jazz bands and stuff. It's just some weird records by like George Wein and Beverly Jenkins. Shirley Scott makes a string of great organ records in the early mid-60s there. But Impulse is a wonderful label, and by the mid-60s, Bob Thiel's running the show, and they delve into the avant-garde free jazz thing that Coltrane's pushing the perimeters on. And Pharoah Saunders and Archie Shepp, and eventually Al Eiler comes later. They have this incredible body of work of some of the most cutting-edge jazz to be recorded. Marion Brown's another one. They're still doing some pretty commercial stuff in those years. They're squeezing in titles from Milt Jackson and Ben Webster, and a pretty wide mix. And it's often reviewed as just a label for the avant-garde, which it wasn't. But they certainly do more avant-garde than any other label does at that time. Leads us to number 4, Verve and Clef and Norgran. Verve, Clef, Norgran were all the child of Norman Granz. Norman Granz is one of the great white jazz impresarios. He booked and toured with all the great jazz cats, brought them around the world. He gave them all contracts to record for Clef, which turned into Verve. Verve in the late 50s houses almost all the greats from the swing era, from Lester Young to Coleman Hawkins to Ben Webster. It's Roy Eldridge, Johnny Hodges, you name the great players of the 30s and 40s, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Oscar Peterson. It's a long list of jazz giants. Sonny Stitt, that record consistently at Verve. Stan Getz from the early 50s into the late 50s. By 61, Creed Taylor leaves Impulse and comes to Verve, and he changes the direction to Verve. He brings the gatefold jacket there, and he fires a lot of the old swing guys, keeps a few of them like Dizzy Gillespie and Johnny Hodges and Count Basie, but he gets rid of most of the other cats. Brings in a whole new stable of musicians, the Bill Evanses, the Wes Montgomerys, the Kai Windings, Jimmy Smith from Blue Note. He kind of guts the small labels and brings all these big artists over to the bigger pay at Verve. And Verve becomes the coffee table music of the 60s, the jazz that people would hear and see in their living rooms, and it was accessible. It was never too on the edges. It was oftentimes very polished and produced. He was going to give direction to his productions. When we say Cal Tjader Breeze from the East, these songs are all going to have an Eastern feel to them. We're going to bring in the right musicians, the right technicians, the right instruments, and we're going to look for that koto from Japan to make this sound happen. And so there's a great deal of production value to what happens with Verve and Creed Taylor. That leads us to number 3, and that's the great Riverside, founded by Orrin Keepnews and Bill Grauer in 1953 or so. They got some great titles in the 10-inch era. A lot of it's kind of Dixieland, New Orleans style. They start reaching out to guys like Don Elliott to make some more modern stuff, and then they sign Thelonious Monk. And Monk had been with Blue Note in 49-50. He'd gone to Prestige for a couple of years, made some great records there with Sonny Rollins, Art Blakey, and a few others. I believe he makes some stuff with Milt Jackson. But Monk was kind of a free agent. No one was really valuing his stuff at this point. They bring him in, and the rest is kind of history. Riverside has this huge, important piece now with Monk, and then that leads to them eventually getting guys like Wes Montgomery, Bill Evans, the Adderley brothers come over. It's a very impressive roster. Blue Mitchell makes some great records here. It's the Riverside canon from 58 through 61, 62 is as great as any other label out there. And like I said, they're number 3 on the list, and it's the shortness of their lifespan that keeps them from being higher than Prestige. I think they make a better quality product than Prestige, 58 through 62. They're second behind number 1 in my eyes in those years. But the early 50s, their content's not as good as Prestige, and by 63, 64, they're going into bankruptcy. Bill Grauer passes away, and Keep New stays in the scene for a long time. And Riverside Jazzland, of course, make a lot of great important recordings, but they end up number 3 on my list, which is still a high place to be in this kingdom. Number 2 is Prestige, and Bob Weinstock runs Prestige with an iron fist. It's very much a money-driven label. They reissue albums constantly with different titles, different leaders. The same music could have 3 different releases with 3 different covers under 3 different artist names. He was very much a scoundrel. He treated his musicians pretty poorly, but he did record a lot of great black musicians, and that's the trade-off. You know, guys like Herman Lubinsky, guys like the Chess Brothers, guys like Bob Weinstock, they might not have been great guys, but they definitely gave an opportunity to a lot of black guys, purely for financial reasons. They saw the chance to make some bucks on a market that wasn't being tapped or reached. You know, someone's got to record these black guys. They made the music, you know. So Weinstock, his repertoire of stuff going back into the late 40s, early 50s, it's better than Blue Note even at that point. You know, he's got early recordings of Monk, early recordings of Miles, Lee Conant, Stan Getz, Sonny Stitt. A lot of great cats were recording for him in the early 50s. And then it just kind of continues into the late 50s, the LP era, the 7000 series, just some landmark stuff, Tad Dameron, Tommy Flanagan, just giants of the music. In 58, 59, they launched the New Jazz imprint, and they started putting the more experimental stuff over there. The Eric Dolphys, the John Coltrane made some incredible recordings. Mal Waldron makes some great stuff. Again, Prestige's body of work is really impressive. The average quality of those records isn't as great as Riverside and Blue Note. They don't sound as rehearsed or as united in their feel from track to track, from musician to musician. On a Riverside or a Blue Note title, it feels like everybody is on the same page. There's a lot of Prestige recordings where it feels like the bass guy player and the drummer don't even like the guy playing the horn. You know, there just feels to be a discord more frequently. Kenny Burrell makes some great recordings at Prestige, one of my favorites. So Prestige is firmly number 2, and by the 60s they've kind of gone into the soul jazz thing as well, with all the great Willis Jacksons and Gene Ammons and Jack McDuffs and Shirley Scott, and I love all that stuff. It's all fun, it's good drinking, really brilliant stuff. And then of course it's just number 1, Blue Note. And Blue Note is the giant among giants. Its body of work in the early 50s is probably not as good as Prestige's in the 10-inch era. And it's interesting, what I've been kind of noticing recently is how few of their 10 inches they actually reissue. That body of work, that 70 titles in the 5000 series of the Blue Note 10-inch series, they reissue the J.J. Johnson stuff, they reissue the Monk stuff, the Bud Powell stuff, the Miles Davis stuff, and then they kind of just start, Kenny Dorham gets their title reissued, but then they just start releasing new stuff by mid-55, 56, and they're still putting a few things out from 53, 54 that had already been reissued, but for the most part, that body of work on the 10-inch series, a lot of it doesn't get reissued. A lot of it was licensed from other labels, European labels. I'm not an expert on the 10-inch series yet. I have maybe a third of it, and I want to continue collecting that. When I start buying records again, collecting the Blue Note 10-inch series is going to be one of the things in my crosshairs. A lot of it's being reissued, which makes them affordable. But the Blue Note 1500 series is legendary, and by 1545, 1560, they're starting to bring in guys like Lee Morgan and Johnny Griffin, and by 1560 through into the 1500 series, is one of the greatest stretches in 1958-59 in jazz history. They launched the 4000 series in '59, and it just continues. Hank Mobley, Lee Morgan, Donald Byrd, Jackie McLean, Duke Pearson, the body of work, Horace Parlan. It's high level, high integrity art. It's not meant to be pastel and pasty and meant for easy accessibility and drinkability. This was complex art made with real raw emotion. It's the blackest affair of any label. It's almost exclusively black artists being recorded by these two little Jewish guys, Alfred Line and Frank Wolf, which is it's an impressive statement in and of its own self. Most labels, it was a 50-50 affair. Prestige was probably the second blackest label, but they had still quite a few significant white artists. Blue Note really has very few in the classic Blue Note lineage, and they sell to Liberty in 1967. But the streak from 55 to 67, it's a pretty incredible run where almost everything is in the jazz canon. Almost everything. That's unbelievable. Almost everything has high collectability. A good Blue Note record sold 5,000-6,000 copies in the day. Of course, they've been reissued numerous times, but it's driven the cost up of what original Blue Notes go for. Hank Mobley records go for thousands of dollars. Lee Morgan records go for thousands of dollars. Coltrane Blue Train can go for big bucks. That's kind of driven attention to the label, to the modern collector. A guy starting out 6 months in knows about the Blue Note thing, and he's starting to dig into the more obscure Blue Note stuff because he wants to have an old Blue Note. Everybody does. And so the legacy of Blue Note is just so impressive. Nothing documents the black experience in that coded message of hard bop better than what Blue Note does. And then in the 60s, they dabble in the avant-garde better than anybody. The Hancock stuff, the Wayne Shorter stuff, the Jackie McLean stuff. They really do some stuff that's got some edges, some dissonance, but it's brilliant, it's modern, it's effective, it's timeless. The Grasham Moncourt record is one of my favorite records of that ilk. It's really an incredible legacy, and Blue Note deserves all the credit in the world. So if you collect those 12 labels and a few Bethlehem for me, you'll really have the bulk of the jazz canon from this era. Like I said, Fantasy has some titles, Jubilee has some titles, Roost definitely has some titles, ABC, Dawn, United, Candid, VJ, they all slip titles in to the canon. But they're either very short, small runs, Dawn was around for 3 years, or a lot of their stuff schlockier like Capitol. You know, Fantasy, a lot of their stuff tends to be kind of Latin feeling, and a lot of live recordings of Brubeck and Cal Jader, and it's good stuff, but I don't feel like all of it's jazz canon worthy. So those are the 12. I hope you guys enjoyed that. The heat's coming back today. It's going to be near 95, I think. The humidity's pretty high. It's only like 10 o'clock and I'm already sweating. So anyway, appreciate you all. Y'all have a great day. Talk to you soon. Peace.